Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Comedic Pedro, 1972. You see this t-shirt I'm wearing, U.S. National Parks. And I wore it because in 1972 I turned 12, and the Boy Scouts was a really big part of my life. You know, life is always changing. And in 1971, I had joined Boy Scouts, went to Beaumont summer camp, and had a really good time. A wonderful week, and it was pretty. We had good weather. I didn't have a responsibility, and it just seemed to be extremely enjoyable. Really good experience. Now, our troop, Boy Scout Troop 490, every summer we'd go to Beaumont for a week, and in 72 we were back, the summer of 72, and this time I was a patrol leader of the Hawk Patrol. And the experience that week was completely different. And it was a very tough week. And because the weather, it seemed like we got a lot of rain. And I had responsibility for this, for my patrol, like 5-6 guys, because, I was a leader. And I struggled with that responsibility. And then we had all this rain, and the campsite was really muddy, and, it was tough. And the thing is, we had to cook our meals on wood fires. And it was just, how are you going to build a fire when it's all muddy? So we had to. The thing is, we ended up. I remember it must have been Mr. Euchre, Mr. Hagen. They had us push together mud and make kind of a platform. Where it would be, and then we built our fires on top of this, maybe a 2-foot high, elevation of mud, which then I guess the mud could drain a little bit, and then you could build a fire. It was tough. Anyway, so that was a tough week. Yeah, interesting. And that's how life is. Life's always changing, and you have good times and you enjoy life, and then hard times come. And I remember one day I was beside myself, just going crazy with stress, and we had this thing. It was we called it a hot pot holder. It was something you would pick up a pot because the handle was too heavy. I guess in your kitchen you'd use this sort of a cloth thing, but we had it was kind of like pliers that had a little curvy thing, and you'd pick up the pot. And it was very important because we didn't have these the home things in the home of the cloth kind. So you got to get the pot off the fire. You can't pick it up with the handle because it's too hot. It's metal. So anyway, this was lost. The hot pot holder was lost, and I was beside myself. What are you gonna do? So I got so frustrated. I went into the woods, went into the forest, just to get away from this all the pressure I felt and the stress I was feeling. And I believe I prayed, just sometimes you just pray out of desperation. And I remember I prayed, and then there was there was a dead tree, kind of a small tree, and it was in the shape of a cross, and the sunlight shone on that dead tree that looked like a cross. And I thought, whoa, look at that, and made an impression. Then I went back to the campsite, and we found the hot pot holder. So life went on, and we were able to overcome that situation. So anyway, boys. But even though it was a tough week, I stuck with Boy Scouts. It was a huge part of my life. I remember later when I applied to college, you have to have extracurricular activities to apply to college. And I remember I said, my big one was Boy Scouts, and my sister Patricia said, "Oh, Peter, you have to have more than just the Boy Scouts." Anyway, now the cover of the video today is from the TV show MASH, which was a very popular television show. It started in 1972, went to 1983, 256 episodes. And the title is an acronym. When you watch the show, it would be capital M and an asterisk, and then the capital S and an asterisk, capital MASH with asterisks between the letters. And that acronym stands for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. The program was set during the Korean War, which was from 1950 to 1953. It was actually there was a movie, 1970 movie MASH, And actually, it all started with a 1968 movie, MASH, a novel about 3 Army doctors by Richard Hooker. So anyway, so the program, the show is about this MASH unit, the 407th MASH unit, which was really a medical place. Wounded soldiers would be brought there for treatment, surgery, and for care. And it was all tense. Everything was tense, because apparently it's a war, and maybe they'd have to move quickly. So it was all intense. And the thing that made the program great was it was actually aired during the Vietnam War, or at least in the early years, at least up until 1975. It was kind of it's definitely an anti-war show. And even though it was set in Korea, it was kind of like Vietnam as well, against the Vietnam War, which was, there was a lot of people against the war. It was a controversial war. But the thing that made MASH great was these characters, and very unique, and their camaraderie. They all wanted to go home, but they were there in this situation. And it was a tough situation, because especially all these, the helicopters would bring in. They'd hear the helicopters, and they knew that wounded soldiers were coming, and they needed to be taken off the helicopters and brought to the surgical area, and figure out who needed what type of attention, who would needed the most care. So these, the main character, the star, was Hawkeye Pierce, played by Alan Alda, and he is this funny guy. He complained a lot, and he really wanted to go home, but he had a strong spirit. Yeah, and I heard nowadays some women today are offended by his behavior, because he was tended to be a womanizer, always didn't have a steady girlfriend, but it was always hitting on women. And the one thing I didn't like about it was a lot of drinking. They would drink a lot, and they're staying in these tents. Another star was Hot Lips Houlihan, or Margaret Houlihan, played by Loretta Swit. She was a nurse and strong-willed person, and her character kind of evolved. She was set up. She was like the girlfriend of this character, Frank Burns, played by Larry Linville, and they had a role. He was married, and this Frank Burns character was. The interesting thing is 3 of the characters left. These actors, for whatever reason, they decided to leave, but they replaced them with characters and actors who were probably maybe as good or better. So anyway, she had this romance with Frank Burns, and she would be and early on she was in conflict with Alan Alda, or with Hawkeye Pierce. Maxwell Klinger, played by Jamie Farr. He was this real character, funny guy. He was trying to get a Section 8, so-called Section 8, discharge for being mentally ill. So he was always wearing a dress. Real funny guy. And this character is from Toledo, Ohio. He had this, sometimes he'd have this baseball cap with a T. I think it was a Texas Rangers cap, at least that's what it looked like to me. So anyway, Maxwell Klinger, who was this really very beloved character, funny guy. Father Mulcahy, played by George Morgan, a Catholic priest. Yeah, he was this very kind, good-natured fellow, and funny guy, and everybody, and he was important, help, good, a good guy to have around, and obviously for everybody, for the wounded soldiers, and for all the people there. Good fellow. Trapper John McIntyre, played by Wayne Rogers. This was the first guy who was living with Hawkeye Pierce. Funny guy. They were partners in crime, and he left. He left, and he was a major character, but he was replaced by this guy. Let's see here, B.J. Honeycutt, who was played by Mike Farrell, and it was this replacement became like the sidekick or good friend of Hawkeye Pierce, and was just as good or better. And then there was let's see, Henry Blake, played by McLean Stevens, he was the commanding officer. Henry Blake, played by McLean Stevenson, and he left as well. And there was this, traumatic scene. Well, he didn't die, but in the movie, he's going home. Not in the movie, the TV show. He's going home, and his airplane is shot down over the Sea of Japan. So they all feel really bad for his death. Of course, he didn't actually die. The character didn't die. Radar O'Reilly was for some people the most popular. He was the guy who worked for the commanding officer. he knew everything. And it's funny, he would come in to. It seems like they called him Radar, that he always knew what was going on, and he would come in when this Colonel Blake, he'd say, Radar, I want you to do, and he'd start saying exactly what Radar would be saying exactly what Colonel Blake was saying, and he was really really very important. Wasn't the commanding officer, but very important in keeping everything running. He knew everything that was needed to be done. Radar O'Reilly. Everybody loved Radar, and he was from the character's from Ottumwa, Iowa. So he was, they're all yearning to go home, and for him, Ottumwa, Iowa was home, yearning to go home. Sherman Potter, played by Harry Morgan, he became the new commanding officer. Yeah, and did a really good job. He was an older guy, a little bit stern but funny, and a good leader, and so he did a real good job replacing Henry Blake. Colonel Blake. Henry Blake sometimes I remember he'd wear this hat that had like fishing lures on it with fish hooks. And sometimes he would salute a superior and his hand would get stuck saluting in a fish hook. Pretty funny. And Charles Emerson Winchester III, who became the replacement for this Frank Burns, who left. Yeah, I think, Larry Linville, who played Frank Burns, got frustrated with the character because he was such a... sort of immature, selfish, and not a really good person. And this Charles Winchester III, played by David Ogden Stiers, he was like an intellectual, and he's a pretty funny guy and really distinctive. Now, the last episode was called Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen. Yeah, I remember, and that was, I think, one of the most watched. I read that the highest percentage of American TVs tuned in to the show. It was a big news in 1983 when the final episode of MASH. People were like, "Oh wow, big deal." I think it was extra long. In the episode, the Korean War comes to an end, and so they're all going home. And I remember, in Hawkeye and BJ, they were having this. Hawkeye kept saying, we're going to say goodbye, and BJ didn't want to say goodbye. Yeah, so that was kind of an interesting thing. There's another character who was this, I don't know the name of the actor. The character was a psychiatrist, and his name was Sidney supposedly named after Sigmund Freud. And he would come and help these people because sometimes they would have problems, mental problems, dealing with the stress they were under. Yeah, and this one scene was very touching where Hawkeye was on a bus, and this woman, apparently they had to keep quiet. There was a dangerous situation. She killed her child or smothered the child, a baby, because it was crying, and he was traumatized by this thing that happened, and he initially said it was a chicken, and the lady said no, it was a baby. So anyway, this was this program, very beloved, extremely popular, and we always watched it, because it was funny, and we're dealing with realities of life, dealing with war. They did a really good job. So that was the MASH TV show. Now, in 1972, the events of the year. On January 4th, the first handheld calculator was released to the public, $395. It's funny. I got one not too long ago for $1 at the Dollar Tree here in Rocky River. And I remember when they first came out, some people had them, and they were expensive. Yeah, and then the prices kept going down. And the math teachers early on, didn't like, this is terrible. The kids need to learn how to calculate, divide. They need to have the knowledge of multiplication and so forth. On January 11th, East Pakistan was renamed Bangladesh. Yeah, it had become independent broken off from West Pakistan, and then West Pakistan just became Pakistan. Okay, the two Pakistans had broken up. On the two Muslim countries, they were one Muslim country on each side of India, but they couldn't. It was too hard to have one country, but separated by a distance, such a big distance. On the 24th of January, a Japanese soldier, Sergeant Shochi Yokoi, was discovered in the jungle of Guam. 28, how many years after? 1945, 28 years after the Second World War was over. this guy, these so-called Japanese stragglers, they had such a commitment to winning the war, and they didn't believe the war was over. This was one of the last guys. In Guam. There was a Chamorro out hunting wild pigs, and they saw this guy running. And who is this? And so he took off and found this guy. And so Sergeant Yokoi had been living for a while, for years with other soldiers, but finally he was alone. And when I was in Guam, I went with my wife and son, Alice, and our son Tim. We went to where he lived. It's a tourist spot now. Yeah, you go to see where Sergeant Yokoi's cave. And he made all those years living in the jungle. And he was like fishing for, I think, like crawfish. And, he was eating, wild plants. He must have been hunting, they have wild pigs. Sergeant Yokoi, yeah. So he went back to Japan, to a hero's welcome in Japan. And apparently got married, came back to Guam on his honeymoon. And this went on for years. I know, into the 70s. I think by now they've all died because it's been so long. But that was such an interesting thing. Amazing dedication to country. February 17th, the sales of the Volkswagen Beetle exceeded that of the Model T, 15,007,034. Yeah, so I think this was the most cars of one particular car. The Model T had been number one. The Volkswagen Beetle. From the 21st to the 28th of February, U.S. President Richard Nixon was in China, meeting with Mao Zedong. And this was the beginning of the opening of China to the outside world. And the U.S. The U.S. had no relationship and no trade, and ironically, we were actually at war with them, in Vietnam, and had been in Korea. But this was the beginning, really, of course, the real change is when Mao died, and that's when really positive change came to China. This was the beginning of the opening of China, and eventually leading to tremendous trade between U.S. and China and the whole world, really. So this was big news when Richard Nixon went to China, because he was a Republican who were strong anti-communists. March 2nd, Jean Bedel Bokassa became president of the Central African Republic, and later a famous dictator. He was pretty bad. He had himself, at one point, proclaimed emperor, had a very expensive coronation in Central Africa. On the 15th of March, The Godfather movie premiered in New York City. Of course, it became a trilogy, and kind of a pretty dark trilogy with the organized crime. April 10th, the United States and the USSR, along with 70 nations, signed a treaty banning biological weapons. That was really good. The 17th of April, was the first Boston Marathon allowing women to run. Very good. Finally, the 22nd of April, Sylvia Cook and John Fairfax finished rowing across the Pacific Ocean. I can't believe that. How could you do something like that? I didn't even, found it on Wikipedia. Yeah, they must not have had a big storm, or if they did, they must have had a bigger boat coming along to help them in a storm. Okay, on the 27th of April, around this time, there was what was called the Burundi Genocide. 500,000 Hutu people died. This was this horrible ethnic conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis. In this case, initiated by or carried out by the Tutsi army of Burundi. And of course, later in the 90s, it would be more of the same thing. This horrendous conflict and another genocide involving the Hutus and Tutsis of East Africa. On the 15th of March, Okinawa was returned by the United States to Japan after 27 years. After all those years after, it was held after the war, or at the end of the war. And it was like a U.S. military area, and finally turned back. I think there still is a U.S. military base there. The 26th of May, Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev, leaders of the U.S. and the Soviet Union, signed the SALT Treaty, arms control, trying to reduce the number of weapons to make the world safer, specifically nuclear weapons. In July, Jane Fonda toured North Vietnam and was photographed sitting on an anti-aircraft gun. And this was offensive to a lot of. She was in the anti-Vietnam War movement, a big leader, and daughter of Henry Fonda, and then And they called her Hanoi Jane after this, and she's never lived it down, and she's apologized for it. And a lot of Vietnam soldiers and veterans were very offended and still upset with her for doing that. On the 10th of July, George McGovern became the Democratic nominee for U.S. president. In will be the election in November. On September 5th and 6th, 11 Israeli athletes were murdered at the Munich, Germany Olympics by Arab terrorists. This was an early sign of this, the Islamic Jihad movement, and the conflict between Israel and the Muslim world. It was very troubling. September 17th, MASH, the TV show episode on CBS, became a very popular TV show. The 23rd of September, Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law in the Philippines. He'd been legally elected and reelected, and now he became a dictator, which was really very tragic. And that dictatorship lasted up until for another 14 years later, until it finally came to an end. On September 30th, Pittsburgh Pirate outfielder Roberto Clemente got his 3,000th base hit at the very end of the season for his career, and he died. He never played. That was his last, because he died in an airplane crash later in the year. On the 24th of October, Jackie Robinson died at age 53. The first African American to play Major League Baseball, died very young, very tragic. He was really, he'd been through a lot, and his son had died. His son had become trouble, but was actually okay, but then died in a car accident. And then, so I'm sure that had an effect on him. And Jackie Robinson kind of wore himself out, because he was very, very busy doing a lot of different things and active in the civil rights movement. November 7th was the U.S. presidential election, and Richard Nixon won in a landslide against George McGovern, the Democratic nominee. I think only Massachusetts voted for Nixon, and then, of course, later he had to resign because of the Watergate scandal. And George McGovern initially had Tom Eagleton as his vice presidential nominee, but there was news came out that Eagleton had been hospitalized for mental illness, so he had to withdraw. And then his running mate was Sargent Shriver, who was married into the Kennedy family, married a sister. I think it was Eunice Shriver, sister of John, Robert, and Ted. Okay, and the 23rd of November, the Steelers, there was a playoff game, and this must be, I think I'm screwing up here. I think this is, anyway, I think it's in December. The Pittsburgh Steelers and Oakland Raiders were playing a playoff game, had the so-called Immaculate Reception. I was watching that game, and the Steelers had the ball, and it was 4th down, and Terry Bradshaw put the ball up, threw a ball, and it was batted down by Oakland cornerbacks. But Franco Harris caught the ball off the rebound and near the ground, and ran in for a touchdown. So that was a big deal in that game. The 26th of December, Harry Truman died in Kansas City, Missouri. Former U.S. President Harry Truman at the end of the Second World War. On the 31st of December, last day of the year, Roberto Clemente died. He was on a relief mission from Puerto Rico going to Nicaragua that had a bad earthquake, and the airplane went down shortly after takeoff, and he died. Very tragic. And also, not sure about the dates, in 1972, the first women were admitted to Dartmouth College. And my sister actually enrolled there a few years later, 1976. And also in 1972, the Yellow River dried up for the first time in China. It must have had a very hot, dry summer. Now, in our family, my father, both my parents turned age 48. They were, busy people. The thing is, my sister had died the year before, so they were really hurting. And I'm sure the whole year. And something like that, if you have a child that dies at age 16, really at any age, but especially so they were hurting, throughout the year. I'm sure I wasn't that aware of it, because I was a kid, still young, but they were really hurting, and I don't think they were as busy, although they were having a tough time. They were having a very tough time, but they got through it. And there was talk in our family of moving, because my mom she didn't want us every time she saw my sister's room, she'd feel bad. She wanted to get away from that, but so we have, and I was against. I didn't want to move. It's the only home that I knew, but we did move, and because that's what my dad had the money, and they wanted to get away. I felt bad about that, but anyway, that's what they did. Now, my brother Mark turned 20 in November. He was early part of the year. He was at Oberlin College. He was a freshman. In the fall, he was a sophomore, and he was somewhat troubled. I would say it was tough on him. Mark and Pam had been rivals, sibling rivals, and she was gone. And and it's my father had been at Oberlin College in the early 40s, and then my brother Mark in the early 70s. But the country had changed, and they really had different experiences at Oberlin, and of course they were different people as well, different times, different people. Yeah, we didn't see much of Mark, and it's funny because we went from a family of 6 to a family of 4, but life is always changing. So he was having his struggles in college at Oberlin. Of course, our sister Pamela was in heaven, so it's can't really give an update on her. She was gone, but God bless her. She died the previous April, but I always thought of her as my sister. So she was in the next world where we all go, and between incarnations on this earth, we spend time there in heaven. My sister Patricia turned 15. She went from the first 6 months she was at the junior high, and then in the fall she started at the high school. She was between grades 8 and 9. So I think probably the high school was a little bit better than the junior high. Was pretty tough. I was in the first 6 months, I was at grade 6, so I finished up at Kensington Elementary School. And in the fall, I started at the junior high, and I was having a tough time. I think, like a lot of guys, changes in life. The elementary school was real nice and mellow and so forth, and the junior high, I found it pretty tough. And actually, the last day of the baseball season, I went with my father and my friend of mine, Rick Donaldson, and his father. We sat. It was actually a doubleheader, last 2 games of the season. Cleveland Indians against the Baltimore Orioles, and Mr. Donaldson said, "Oh, this might be the last games for Brooks Robinson, the famous third baseman for Baltimore." Although it turns out he played I think at least two more years. And I had started at the junior high, which had this, I had this short walk to Kensington, and all of a sudden I had a long walk, homework, stress of grades, and difficult kids, all these kids I didn't know, because the 5 elementary schools funneled in from to the junior high: Kensington, Beach, Bates, Goldwood, and Worcester. All these kids I didn't know, in just the 2 grades. So, plus this long walk, and I used to carry my trombone back and forth to school, at least on the weekends, so I could practice during the week as well. Kind of a bulky thing to carry around. But anyway, at that doubleheader, I was not really into professional sports. I think I was facing a tough situation, and my family we were having problems in the family, and then in the junior high, I was facing that. And for some reason, I decided, I want to get into this, Cleveland sports. And I did. So that was the beginning, that doubleheader. And we'll talk more next time, 1973. And actually in the fall, I followed the Cleveland Browns since the Indian season was over. The Browns, and I think the Cavs as well. So in 1972, we were a good family. I had good parents. They were sad. Definitely, they were sad, and we were struggling. But it all leads to the spiritual path. All these things in life, the things that happen, leads us, and that's what's important. And I'm in an amazing spiritual path, self-realization fellowship. So like the expression, which I really agree with. It's all good. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.